We're going to be talking about some very, very fascinating subjects today. This is my favorite subject to talk about, and that's the idea of what does it really mean to be human? What are we doing here? What's the big picture? What's the game? What are we supposed to be learning? What's the objective? Why are we doing this? Why are we in physical bodies that can have suffering and pain and misery and joy? And let's not forget that, because sometimes it seems like it's all just one thing. And the media is trying to get you to think that it's all bad all the time. So I want to ask some big questions. This is a UFO conference. So ultimately, it's about UFOs. And UFOs are the beginning of a discussion, but they are not the end of the discussion. The discussion branches out into subjects like what you see on the television show Ancient Aliens. In other words, we got them here now, and we're only seeing saucers in the sky. And yet, in ancient times, we have civilizations that essentially popped up out of the box, 100% technologically advanced. And you'll notice the other night, how many did not see my panel interview the other night? Raise your hand if you didn't see the panel. Okay. So I had a panel with John Anthony West there, and he's the rogue Egyptologist who came out with the idea that the back end of the Sphinx has this rippling structure that looks like it was actually eroded by water, and therefore water falling on the Sphinx couldn't have happened to enough degree to cause that for at least the last 10,000 years. So it's got to be older than that. And yet John Anthony West, interestingly enough, on our panel became the skeptic and didn't want to say that there was any extraterrestrial component at all. And I didn't want to lower the hammer on him in front of a huge audience of people, but if I had done so, I would have said, dude, because, you know, I got to talk in that kind of young adult way. It disarms people, even though I'm 41. It's because of the alien DNA. Aging doesn't affect me very much. But anyway, I would have said, dude, how do you explain that this civilization pops up out of the box with technology that we don't have now? We're not levitating 100-ton blocks of stone and putting them together like Tinker Toys. What's up with that? But as far as he'd taken it was the idea that there was some sort of psychic power that they had to be able to levitate stone. Well, even developing that power suggests a very advanced form of civilization, but the problem is, if they had that power, then why wouldn't they have built anything else but pyramids? Why would they only build pyramids once they developed that power? Why wouldn't they have machines and gadgets and technology? So the fact that there are no artifacts in the fossil records suggesting any type of progression up to the level of building pyramids, quid pro quo means they didn't come from here. The question then becomes, where the heck did they come from and what are they doing here and why are they hiding? I've been asking that question all weekend. This all became very present beginning in 1947. This is the history of UFOs. I'm going to go through it briefly. If you've seen Wisdom Teachings, my show on Gaiam TV, some of this will be familiar to you, but the way I talk through it is not, and the arrangement is totally different, and there's some new things. So Kenneth Arnold in 1947 was a pilot who was flying along in Pendleton, Oregon, and he saw 9 bright saucer-like objects flying at an incredible speed, and he had no idea what they were. And he said that he saw them at 3 p.m. in the afternoon flying between Mount Rainier and Mount Adams in Washington State, and they wove in and out of formation, and he estimated they were going 1,200 miles an hour. Now, this is the origin of the term flying saucer. This is where it started. But interestingly enough, they only said saucer-like. The actual shape was a horseshoe. Some people don't know this. If you watch my show, you know this, but most people don't realize this. It's obviously very, very aerodynamic, but it's a totally different type of design than what we have now. 12 days later, this is very interesting. 12 days later, there was a sighting of the exact same type of craft with photographs. And this was by William Rhodes in Phoenix, Arizona, not too far from where we are right now. And this is his rather nondescript-looking ranch on some very flat land and just a boring old building there. And here's the front gate. And he was standing out there, and this object starts circling around the top of his ranch. What the heck is that? Well, he starts snapping pictures of it. And this was on July 7th, 1947, a date that might be a little bit familiar to you. If you're a real UFO geek, you know why that date is important. Because, guess what? The Roswell crash was the same night, and it was the same shaped object, and it crashed one state away in New Mexico. So we got 3 data points now. We got an eyewitness sighting from a reputable pilot. We got a guy who actually photographs it over his land before the era of photo manipulation. And the Roswell crash then occurs, was covered up by the government after they actually told the truth. The flying saucer term had just come into vogue only a couple weeks before, and now they've captured one. They didn't say weather balloon, they just said flying saucer straight up. And then this newspaper from the next day, before the cover-up showed up, actually says General Ramey empties the Roswell saucer. And here, I finally found a higher resolution version of this. That's a real headline. Do you really think that if somebody finds a weather balloon, that the leading, bleeding headline on top of the newspaper is going to say that he empties a flying saucer out? No, that's a guy who found a saucer, and he goes inside and he pulls out all the goodies. That's what this is. Well, this is one eyewitness description of what it looked like, and this one is another eyewitness description, including the little being that came out. And there have been many drawings and models made of this since then. This is another example right here. This is actually a model that you can buy and build yourself because there's been so many eyewitness testimonies of what this thing looked like. And here's another example where you actually get a little clear capsule that you can see the interior of the ship as well. So let's look inside the ship now. This is based on very good eyewitness testimony. You got these beings inside. Now, the eyes are wrong, okay? They did not have black eyes. For some reason, this artist did that incorrectly. But notice the control panels that they got their hands on. That is totally accurate. The shape of the seat is accurate. The shape of the interior is accurate. And the little rod in the middle is accurate. All the rest of this is accurate. The only thing that's wrong is their eyes. I have another picture that is otherwise inaccurate, but does show you what their eyes actually looked like. And their eyes are very large with unusually large irises. The rest of it actually looks, as I said, like this. Now here's an interesting thing. If you're looking at those hands on the panels closely, you'll notice that there's too many fingers. These are panels made for 6-fingered hands, and many people have not seen this, but we actually have leaked photographs of the objects that General Ramey emptied out of the saucer. And here he is, or somebody, pointing at the panels. And then this one, you really can see the panels in good clarity. Notice that there are 6 fingers there. Also notice that there's lots of little dots along the panels. Those are fiber optics. Before we had fiber optic cables, folks. That's where we got it from, is from this. And they shoot light through them and they transmit data. Well, for some reason, this thing seems to be using your acupuncture points. And you can actually see pretty clearly that if he raises up his hand off of the control panel, he or she then has this slider. And the slider would probably determine things like the speed that the object is going. You slide your finger through that little half or quarter circle groove that you see up there. So this is a very interesting system, and we've also heard that there's a gravitational pull inside the ship, so your hands go and they pull into the handprints. So you don't, it's like you can go totally upside down, and your hands won't come out. So you can fly any type of crazy aerodynamics that you want to. So on July 8th, 1947, this is when the news goes crazy. You've probably seen some of these before, but they leave nothing to the imagination. RAAF captures a flying saucer. Army reveals it has a flying disc found on a ranch in New Mexico. Possession of a flying disc was disclosed today by the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of Roswell Army Air Base. Disc lands on a ranch in New Mexico and is held by the Army. U.S. Army to examine a flying disc. And notice these are all over the country and the world. You got Roswell, Sacramento, San Francisco, Seattle, and the UK. So there was no doubt what was going on. But then by July 9th, the fix was in. And they come out with this ridiculous disinformation saying that it's a weather balloon. And after all the buzz and all the interest, this is what they tried to sell you on what was the thing that crashed. And ever since then, the government's been doing this apologetic, well, it was actually this. No, it was actually Project Mogul. No, the bodies were actually little crash dummies that we were using to give me a frickin' break. I mean, let's just get clear. This is what they tried to tell you it was. Notice he's got a piece of paper in his hand, and he's got the classic liar's gesture of having his hand over his mouth. Well, I want you to look at this and notice something interesting, and that is that the general has a piece of paper. General Ramey has a piece of paper in his hand. So let's ask another question. If we got the original negative, is it possible to read his orders and actually see what the heck was going on? Believe it or not, somebody did this. This is the close-up of the picture that he's holding in his hand. And thanks to the original negative, you can blow it up super, super, super big. David Rudiak in 2001 used photo enhancement tools and was able to see this up close. Fascinating. If you haven't seen this before, it's fascinating. Now, using a good eye and photo enhancement, and you got to kind of defocus your eyes a little bit, we've been able to read what's on that thing. It clearly says the disc. And it also says, and the victims of the wreck, and in the disc they will ship. And then it also says here, and the viewing of the decoy you connected to thee. That one's very clear. So they obviously set out a decoy. You can even see this is the total reconstruction of enough of it that's visible. It's not the whole piece of paper. But you can see it's got top secret on it at the bottom there. So this was a cover-up, and this is actually a military gesture that guys in the military are taught to use when they get captured, because it's the gesture of squatting to go to the bathroom in the jungle without going into any graphic details. So he's basically saying, look, this is bullshit. And somehow they got away with putting that out there because nobody really wanted this cover-up to be happening. And here's another guy posing with this ridiculous debris that we're supposed to think was a flying saucer. Thankfully, with the benefit of time and space, we've had insiders come forward with remarkable information, giving us a highly classified look at what all of the different things that have crashed on Earth really are. And this is straight out of the U.S. Air Force, very highly classified. So everything you need to know is right here. Of course, the weather balloon is actually swamp gas, as you can see there. It's fun. It's fun. So not everyone bought the cover-up. Not everyone bought it. 3 different newspapers connected the dots. They published the photos of William Rhodes. They knew that the original eyewitness reports was of a horseshoe-shaped craft crashing, and they connected the dots that Kenneth Arnold saw a horseshoe-shaped craft. So these newspapers published the photos. Well, guess what happens next? Oh, hello there. Agents show up at the newspaper. They didn't like this at all. They raided the offices of the newspaper when nobody was around, and they took all the prints. So the only record of this that we have is actually from the newspaper transparencies that were taken and put on microfiche. So also, Rhodes himself was paid a visit by FBI and Army counterintelligence, and they confiscated the negatives. So we don't even have the negatives of this. Now let's bear in mind that no one ever bothered to debunk William Rhodes or try to say that his photos were fake. They just made them disappear. Now, I have a little cool disappearance thing it's going to do in a second, but before I give you the bells and whistles, take a look at the craft on the bottom right. Do you see that there's like a black mist around it there? Okay, you know what that is? That's coronal discharge of electromagnetic energy. That's caused by the anti-gravity field that the ship is giving off. It actually made a visible spray type of pattern around the craft. So this is not something that the government even tried to say was fake, or that they tried to explain, oh, well, you know, he threw this thing up in the air. You can't mess with that coronal discharge. That's the smoking gun right there. So right at the beginning of Roswell, it all comes out. And now we've got the NASA astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, who has come forward and said that he's personally spoken to some 90 different people who were involved with Roswell, because it was a huge situation. None of them want to speak out. They've all been threatened. Those who are still alive are in serious fear for their lives. And Mac Brazel, the infamous rancher, said he was sorry that he ever said anything about it because he's been harassed by the government. This is the result of people not wanting you to know that this thing was real. So just in case there's somebody in the audience who is still skeptical and you still don't believe it, I actually thought about making a T-shirt that says, if you still don't think UFOs are real, you are mentally ill. And try rocking that shirt, walk down the street, see what happens, right? You're going to get a beat down. But think about this now. If even one UFO sighting or crash report is real, then that automatically means that we are being visited by someone else who is intelligent and can build really cool stuff. We also find out, of course, that the Roswell crash gave us a whole bunch of technology. It gave us computer chips. They reverse engineered those from the ship. I had heard this independently back in 1993, and then 2 years later I go to a UFO conference, and it was confirmed to me by an insider that actually, yes, this is what happened. And there was the book by Colonel Philip Corso that came out in 1997 that also confirmed that it was true and said, yes, we got computer chips, we got fiber optics, we got LED lights. LEDs just work forever, don't they? That's strange. Why do they work? Well, it's an alien technology. And we also got infrared night vision. We got all kinds of good stuff. The first transistor came out, the solid-state transistor. Up until then, you had vacuum tubes that were really hot, and electromagnets either open or close the circuit, and that was it. It wasn't until later on that we start to get solid-state transistors just a few months after Roswell. Why? Because they finally figured out how to build a solid-state transistor, and then that made little radios you could hold in your hand. That was a big, big deal back then. So if these beings are visiting us, and in this case they had 6 fingers on each hand, then what the heck are they doing here? What is going on? Well, there is a big picture that ties it all together, and I believe the answer is found in Tibet. And the answer is ultimately that these beings are helping what you could call God. And that's an aggressive term to use, but I'll use it a few times here and there. They're helping the universe with our soul evolution. That's my conjecture. That's my hypothesis. And most importantly, they are trying to assist our planet to get to the next level of our own human evolution. Everything changed for me in, I guess, 1995 when I found this book at the bookstore, because any new books that came out on this stuff, I was right there grabbing them, because it was before the internet had anything to read on it about this stuff. There was very, very little. This is called Dream Yoga and the Practice of Natural Light. And he's describing in here a meditative practice used by Tibetans where they go into some sort of exalted state of consciousness called the mother light. They say the key is you got to get into the slipstream between being awake and being asleep. And that in that slipstream, it's also the slipstream between living and dying. And when you die, normally you go into the bardo in Tibetan Buddhism, which is the same as like a big bad repeating dream, sort of like Groundhog Day, where you got to go through your karma over and over again and see all the ways that you hurt people and experience their pain as if you had experienced it yourself. Well, there's a place you get to right before you go to the bardo and right before you go to a dream state, and that's called the mother light. And so this whole book was devoted to how do you get there. And the name of their Buddhism is called Dzogchen, which is another name for the mother light. Well, the trick is that if you can start to access this mother light reliably through meditation, getting that slipstream between waking and dreaming, living and dying, then lo and behold, eventually you get to a point where every thought that you have is a thought of love, not anger. And at that point, you have officially graduated from the need to be human. The whole reason why these extraterrestrial beings apparently are here, at least all the good ones, which is the majority, is that we are one of millions of inhabited planets in our galaxy inhabited with human or hominid life. Now, I've had insiders come forward and tell me about the different life forms they've met. There's a lot of them out there. I know one guy who's met over 40. I know another guy who's met 17. I know another guy who's met over 200 or even maybe over 400. There's another guy who's met over 100. Now, these people, you sit down with them and you talk to them, and there is no doubt in your mind that you're talking to somebody who really knows what they're talking about. Why? Because I remember what everybody tells me. I don't disclose a lot of it publicly. That's so that I can weigh out what people are saying. And what you find out is that the people who really know this stuff, they always start saying the same kind of things over and over again. There's no lack of complementarity in their reports. It's very, very similar. So I don't think that you have to get to this Olympic athlete point of meditation where you can get there just to this 100% loving level. That's very, very difficult. When you get put under pressure and stress and difficult things happen, good luck trying to not get angry. I mean, there's things that can happen to you, and so it's a very, very profound discipline to try to get to the point that you never get mad. I certainly am not there yet. I get pissed, and it's not good when I do. But I try not to inflict it on other people. I don't always succeed. Today being one example, but that's a whole other story. Not here. Not here. So Father Francis Tissot in the mid-1990s actually came to Tibet, financed by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, to study this crazy phenomenon that's the after effect of practicing this Tibetan Buddhist teaching. Because what happens is you achieve something called rainbow body, and that's the main subject of what we're here to talk about, and how this all relates to UFOs and synchronicity. He actually personally witnessed the ascension of this man, Khenpo Achos. This man actually dialed back the clock. He told people when it was going to happen. He knew when it was going to occur. They wrapped him up in burial cloth. His body slumps over. He appears dead. They wrap him up in burial cloth, and then during the course of 7 days, his body started to shrink in size. Now, bones don't shrink in size. Skeleton isn't going to shrink. Even if you burn a human body, you still find the skeleton in many cases, unless it's really high heat like cremation. Well, his skeleton, his bones were shrinking, as was the whole body. And as they looked at his face, it got younger and younger looking inside. There were rainbows coming out of the hut where this was happening. There was angelic voices singing. There was wonderful odors coming out, like perfume. All this stuff is taking place because he had achieved what their teaching was there to do, which is to get you to the next level of human evolution. And I ultimately believe this is everybody's destiny. Tibet just got a nice inheritance from the universe that made it a lot easier for them, and we'll talk about how that happened. These are their stupas. This is a symbol of the human energy field, actually. That circle up on top is the crown chakra, and that little room is where the heart is. And then the column, that like cone that's red, it represents the spine and the energy field that goes up the spine as you activate your light body. So they have these all over the place in Tibet. And they have a lot of really beautiful architecture. And so part of what you're going to see is like a really fun slideshow of some of the Tibetan architecture and the places where these really neat things happen. So a common and widely reported rainbow body event, a guy that sort of restarted this because it had fallen out of favor. It had kind of like lost, like people weren't making it anymore. Until the 1800s, this guy was a major figure in Tibet who kind of jump-started the whole thing and figured it out and got it to work and then taught other people what he did. This is actually what he looked like. This is an illustration that he posed for. The ears are probably exaggerated, but otherwise, you know, there he is. So Nyala Pema Dundul sort of took the old teachings and put them all together and created something he called the Union of Primordial Essences. And in 1872, he actually achieved rainbow body in front of 500 witnesses, and they all were going in and out of the hut where this was happening. And after 7 days, he left behind a small body made of nothing but burnt ash. That's all that was left of his human body. They then hid away the little ashy figurine to keep it secure because they didn't want people to see what had happened, which is understandable. They were afraid it would be stolen because it was such a big deal. And then many of his own students also attained rainbow body. So as a result of this, the rainbow body practice was rejuvenated in Tibet. This is more recent now. And before he left, he already had the ability to control matter with his mind, and so he adhered to the ancient tradition of leaving a footprint behind. So what happened here was that they had a flagstone patio, and this is the underneath side of the flagstone. He was walking along, this was just a typical patio, and he mushed his foot into the stone. And what you're seeing here is the bottom, not the part where the footprint is, but the underneath of the stone. Now notice how smooth it is. This suggests that with his mind, he was somehow able to transform the stone into something almost like a liquid or taffy type of consistency. There's no irregularities left in the rock. It's stretched like a balloon. It's very, very interesting. And you're going to see many, many more of these footprints as we go throughout the talk. So another key figure that we need to talk about is a major leader in Tibetan Buddhism who actually did pull it off, Achuk Lama Rinpoche. Here he is. Now this is a lot more recent now. I'm just giving you some examples that are recent. He was the head of the Nyingma sect, which is the sect that has the rainbow body teaching in it. And he meditated for 43 years. That's all he was doing, with Master Tulku Arik Rinpoche. And in 1983, while he was in the midst of doing all this meditation, he established the largest monastery in Tibet called Yarchen Gar. It's a holy city where most of the Rinpoches and Lamas now live in Tibet. This is, in fact, the largest collection of Rinpoches and Lamas in the entire world. And here's an aerial photograph of it today. So it's really big and surrounded by water, which interestingly, I believe that acts as sort of like a conduit to help their meditation go along. But it's a major, major city, and he was the head of it, and he earned the right to be there because he was such an adept meditator. So here he is, late in life, and of course I wore my orange shirt tonight to kind of like commemorate the Tibetan Buddhist robe. It's the closest I can come to right now. I didn't want to come out here wearing a robe. That would be way too new age, right? But I want to point out something. This guy ascended, and look at his teeth. Okay, you don't have to be perfect. He's missing some teeth. He hasn't brushed in a while. It's okay. He still made it. You don't have to be a glamour queen. You're going to be fine. So this is actually the room that he was living in when he ascended. We actually have all this stuff that we can still look at. And it's, you know, a combination of ancient architecture and modern amenities like glass windows. So he actually, because he had meditated so long, the reports are many people saw him do miracles. And these miracles included that he was able to put handprints and footprints in rock wherever he wanted. He could manifest little statues out of thin air. And he also could download new spiritual teachings. This is called termas. And termas also are something where you pull in information from an existing scroll that's hidden away in some faraway location. And then you're graded on how closely you transcribed the original without ever seeing it. And you don't pass unless you get every single word correct. Yeah, it's like Tibetan remote viewing, but on an extreme level. So they definitely believed in channeling, and they believed also that the teachings were evolving, that there's new information that comes out as time goes on that helps you further on your rainbow body quest that they have. So he could stay underwater for days without any harm to himself. He didn't need to breathe. And he could see into the future without any impediment. He had prophecy ability, and he could make visual manifestations. So what you're now going to see is a photograph in which he wanted to show people his rainbow body before he actually ascended. Now, what you're about to see, bear in mind there is no lotus flower in the image, and there is nothing in the image that the original photo was nothing but him sitting there with his legs crossed. Hold on a second. Him sitting there with his legs crossed, and this is what we actually saw on the film. He projected that lotus from somewhere, and he projected an image of his energy body, and you can kind of see his crossed leg above the lotus, but that's it. The rest is all stuff that he manifested in the image. Question in the back.
Yeah. Was there any documentation
Well, that's the problem. There is a community out there, but they don't want the West involved. That's why Francis Tissot was so important, because he was a Westerner who came and witnessed the rainbow body, and actually the Chinese military witnessed the rainbow body. So they don't really like to brag about this stuff. But after he died, his body shrank down to a little figurine of ash, and then what they did is they dressed it up and they made it wear clothes. So, and this is to commemorate his ascension. Now, all these people that saw this, obviously this is real. This is not some fake thing. And they got fans on it because they're worried about it. Again, we'll see the fans in the previous thing. They don't want it to spoil. I guess they might have been worried about it rotting. But anyway, this is on display. You can actually go see it. Another Tibetan Buddhist monk who recently attained rainbow body is Turtan Chakyur Lingpa. And this is his rainbow body. Again, it's a little figurine. They wrap it up in cloth. You're not actually seeing the ash. It's all been wrapped in fabric. But this is another shrine to him. And he leaves this behind for them. We're also going to see now the rainbow body of Chagye Trichen. And here he is. And so when he died, he also left behind a rainbow body, and they locked it up. Notice there's a lock on this case because they're worried about people stealing these. But they dress it up. And so this has happened. There's 160,000 cases of rainbow body occurring, and oftentimes they leave this little body behind. So this is Jirao Kenpo. And he's kind of slouching in his seat. You see, he ought to stand up straight a little more. And here's another illustration of the stupa. And what they do is they put the rainbow body a lot of times inside that little room in the middle that represents the heart, to show how they opened their heart, and that's how they got rainbow body to occur. Now, we're also going to talk a little bit more about another guy who achieved rainbow body. This is Karma Rinpoche, and this just happened last November. So it's a very new, exciting story. He passed away on November the 11th, 2013. He was 5'9". 14 days it took. His body shrank down to 8 inches tall. And everything in his entire body, including the skeleton, shrank 80%, and that's what they call small rainbow body. And this is a picture of him. And here's another picture of him. And then last but not least, this is the wrapped up version of what's left of his body. And supposedly he also left these 2 footprints behind, which they then painted. So he was able to mush his foot into stone. We're going to see a lot more of these as time goes on. So when Lama Achuk, that guy who was the leader of the whole Yarchangar monastery, when he created the rainbow body effect for himself and ascended, essentially, over 100,000 visitors came to pay tribute. This is a real photograph of what happened. So you can see the massive amount of respect that he had, and all these guys are in monk robes. They're all wearing red. You see that? So this was a huge event. Well, here's an example of what you don't want to do. This is a guy, Rangjung Rigpe Dorje, who died in the 1970s. And he did not achieve rainbow body, so not everybody does. And the problem is, this is why Tibetan Buddhists are kind of finicky. You don't want to show off that you have magic powers. But he did. He sat for a photograph and said that he would make himself transparent for the photograph, and a Westerner took this photo of him actually doing that. There is no retouching. There is no airbrushing. This was witnessed by people. He was sitting there. His body actually looked like this in person, and then they took the photograph. And you can actually see through his head. Notice there's that bar behind his head where the head is. You can actually see the design of the bar. But that is showing off, and he blew it. So you gotta. So it's important that like these people don't go too far with it. So I want to take us into before we go back into more of the Tibetan Buddhist stuff. I want to get into another discussion here about the greater essence of why this is happening and what's the cosmic plan for us. Because I believe this is what we're all going to have to do. We're all going to go into rainbow body at some point. You may not do it the way they do. It may happen in grades, because if you read the Law of One material, which is, again, my source teaching for everything, the Law of One clearly states that there are densities of evolution. There's 7 dimensions or densities that we go through. We're in 3rd density now. You go from 3rd to 4th, usually, 4th to 5th, 5th to 6th, 6th to 7th. Well, to go into rainbow body, that's actually the 7th density leap. So you finish the whole class of what you're supposed to do in the universe. But 3rd to 4th density is what most of us are going to be doing. And in order to make that, you only need to be slightly more than 50% focused on love and peace. And you can be 49% evil. And you still get to go to the next dimension. Most of the ETs that are visiting us are 4th density. Some of them are 5th density, and those also help us, but they sort of manage and oversee the 4th density ones who do a lot of the work, the boots on the ground work. And then according to Law of One stuff, 6th density beings usually do not appear before us. They only may do it rarely. But because in this case they really screwed things up for the Earth, they actually have dropped down to 5D and are appearing in craft. So some of the people that channeled the Law of One that calls itself Ra, apparently this was not originally a bad thing. There's a lot of negative publicity right now about Ra. Everybody thinks, oh, that's Illuminati. Well, actually, in the Law of One, they explain what happened. They started out positive, and then the negative beings came in and actually corrupted their message, and that's what started to happen about 10 or 11,000 years ago that led to the creation of the Illuminati. So the stuff, the symbols that the Illuminati are using, like the all-seeing eye and the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Masonic square and compass that indicates geometry, the focus on sacred geometry, building buildings with sacred geometry, this is all the offshoot of what started as a positive teaching and was corrupted by these people. So that's an important point to remember. And by these people, I mean the negative beings that came in and wreaked havoc on it. So the greatest message in the Law of One is this concept that the universe itself is alive. The universe is actually a life form. It's organic, and organic life is everywhere. And if you've seen my other talks, or if you watch my show on Gaiam TV, I've given, or if you read my books, either one of them, Synchronicity Key or Source Field Investigations, I have an extensive amount of scientific data to show that this is actually what's going on. Biological life is everywhere. Just for today, I'm going to give you something a little bit different that you haven't seen on Gaiam TV and you haven't seen in my other talks. You may have read it in the book, but there's only so much data out there. We actually have poked a hole in the theory about DNA. And this is important because, remember, the rainbow body shows that there is something more than the physical that we can transition into. The rainbow body is just a very dramatic, gee whiz kind of way of showing that we have a soul, that we have an invisible essence that is not tethered to the body. You can also see that with near-death experiences. People's body is clinically brain dead. They have brain death. They have no respiration. They have no pulse. There's no electrical activity in the brain, but they record seeing things out there in the waiting room or whatever, and it turns out that it's accurate. So that's fascinating. And there's lots of reports of that going back to the 1970s with Dr. Kenneth Ring and Dr. Raymond Moody. So how important is that soul that's floating out of your body to your actual physical existence and your biological life? As it turns out, it's very important. Very, very important. Your DNA is only actually an antenna that conducts the energy of the soul into your body. That's all it's doing. The soul is actually what makes your facial features. That's why people reincarnate and they look like the person they did before. That's the whole work that you've heard me talk about before with Dr. Ian Stevenson. He researched over 3,000 cases of reincarnation in the Middle East of children that remembered their past lives, and he found out that they could remember accurate details of places they'd never been, people they'd never met, and whenever it was a real case, they looked just like the person they recommended that they had been before, which strongly suggests that reincarnation is real. And of course, as probably most of you know, I have this uncanny facial resemblance to Edgar Cayce, and it's sort of like a blessing and a curse because How many Elvis impersonators can you name? That's not my gig. I'm not trying to look like somebody else. I'm not out there saying, oh, I'm Edgar Casey. You know, people come up to me and they say, oh, Edgar. It's like, no, that's another lifetime, you know. Some people have called me Dave Ed. I've gotten that one a few times. So there's something about who you are that's information. It's pure information. And the DNA is not the key. Scientists up until recently were addicted. Oh, I got to fix that. That's crazy. Hang on a second. Now you're getting the backstage pass here. All right. Let's try this again. Okay. So the human body has 70 to 90,000 proteins. What does that mean? That means that, like, the surface of a hair on your body has a specific protein that makes that type of coating on your hair. The surface of your eye has a certain coating. All of the organs, all the different tissues in the body, there's 70 to 90,000 different proteins that they can go in and measure and actually analyze them and figure out, okay, this is a specific biological thing made out of amino acids that makes the body. Well, there's 70 to 90,000 of those. And up until the year 2000, scientists believed that there must be at least one gene for each protein. Now, what's a gene? A gene is a specific little segment of DNA that's separate from other specific little segments. And this is what they've been studying. So you know that the traditional model has been, oh, well, genes, the DNA molecule has everything, right? Because you can clone a cell, and the DNA appears to have all the information that's needed to clone a fully living organism. But there's something missing, because scientists believed there had to be at least 70 to 90,000 genes, one for each protein, and they also conservatively estimated they had to have another 30,000 genes that would do all sorts of things like regulating the growth of these different proteins and all of the mysterious stuff involved in creating our awareness, our emotions, and our actual intelligence and our memories. So they wanted to think, well, there's a gene for the memories that you have, and there's a gene for anger, and there's a gene for sadness, and all this stuff. So up until 2000, this was a very commonly held view in science, and you'd hear it in college class, and you'd hear it in high school. Oh, the memory is genetic. Everything is in the genes. Well, everybody got a big slap in the face, and then it all went quiet, because when they mapped out the human genome in 2000, they only found that we had 34,000 genes. That's way, way too little. So something crazy is going on here that they can't explain, because 34,000 doesn't account for anywhere near the number of proteins that we have. And then it gets even worse, because this little roundworm called Caenorhabditis elegans is commonly studied, and I practiced that, thank you. Ah, I did it again. Hang on a second. It's too good to not animate this properly, so here we go. So Caenorhabditis elegans is this little roundworm that is studied like crazy in laboratories because it's so primitive. It only has a very small number of cells. In fact, its body has exactly 969 cells and not a penny more. Now, this primitive little roundworm has a very, very primitive brain that is of about 302 ordered cells. So this is a very tiny little thing. It's microscopic. It's considered a microorganism. It's one of the most primitive microorganisms out there. And that's part of why it's studied in the laboratory. It's resilient. They can chop it up. They can dice it up and throw it in a blender and do whatever they want to do with it. This poor little thing has been abused like you can't imagine. But also the human body has 50 plus trillion cells. That's a heck of a lot more than 969. So in the traditional view, right, the number of genes in the human body should be a lot more than this silly little roundworm with 969 cells. How many genes do you think they found in Caenorhabditis elegans? They found 24,000 genes. only 10,000 less than the human body. And then what was even more bizarre was that when they studied the fruit fly only had 15,000 genes, and yet is a far more complex organism with a lot more cells than Caenorhabditis elegans. So the human body only has 10,000 more genes than the simplest, humblest life form that science ever studies as an organism. So you see right here, it's like the emperor has no clothes. We've poked a hole in the mainstream model that is so large that there is nothing you can do about it. It's simply not what we thought. Something has to completely be altered. Now, we're going to stick with our Caenorhabditis worm for a minute, and we're going to talk about a very important point that's mirrored in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, most people think that if you meditate in a cave for 40 years, that you're basically happy all the time, that you're blissed out. Oh, yeah, isn't this great? No, the Tibetan teachings actually say that stress, if you don't have enough stress in your life, you can't achieve rainbow body. The whole point is to see everything as a loving experience, and that means that you actually are stressed out, but then you transfigure your stress into a loving response. And if you don't have enough stress, then you don't get to practice because you're always happy. So you see, actually what's happening right now is we're going through a collective planetary initiation that is deliberately making us really stressed out so that we have a greater opportunity to interpret each experience that we have as a loving experience and try to see the love in it, because that's the core of the Ascension teaching. Every thought is a loving thought. You can't really get there without having really horrible stuff happen to you frequently. And that's what's happening to us now. It's the global initiation. So let's go back to Caenorhabditis for a minute. Oh, Jesus, I did it again. Sorry about that. I actually put these slides in just this morning, so it was all kind of like I got this inspiration, a new way of doing this talk. So there you have it. Let's make sure that I save this so that we don't lose that. All right. Okay. Now we can go. So Caenorhabditis is normally a lactose-intolerant microorganism, and that means it cannot digest milk sugar, and if it tries to, it will die. If it tries to eat the milk sugar, it will actually die. So this scientist named Dr. John Cairns did an experiment where he takes these little roundworms and he places them in an environment where the only food they have is lactose. And normally that would kill all of them, or that's what we were led to believe. And in fact, it's true that most of them die. But a small percentage, somewhere between 2 to 5%, actually live through it. Now, how's that even possible? They got nothing to eat. Think about this for a minute. Think about what I'm saying. How did they stay alive if they have no food? They actually created their own evolutionary leap on a rapid, almost instantaneous scale. It only took a few days. They somehow rewrote their own genetic code and mutated the shape of their mouth so that they actually could eat and digest lactose. Only a couple days. Only a couple days. So if you're squeamish, get ready for the gross out pictures by closing your eyes. I'm going to show you the worm, and then I'm going to show you what its mouth usually looks like. I was not able on such a short timeline to find the new mouth. But here's Caenorhabditis, just a typical microscopic organism, 939 cells. And this is its mouth. And it's been extensively studied. And here's the mouth from the side, which looks disturbingly similar to peyote cactus. But none of you guys know what that is, right? So look at how complex the cellular structure here is. This little guy actually rewrote his own DNA. How does he do that? Well, stress. Stress that he went through. He's dying. He's got to eat. He's got to find a way to eat. Nature found a way. Nature altered his genetic structure somehow. And I believe that's ultimately the key of what's happening to us on a planetary level, is we're all going through stress right now, and we're all experiencing this transformative consciousness. So here's another example. This is Drosophila, the common laboratory fruit fly. This poor little guy has also been very heavily abused in laboratories. They've chopped him up, diced him up, sliced him up, boiled him, burned him, baked him, you name it. He's had everything done. Well, the research on the Drosophila fly, oh, it did it again, sorry. This is just getting to be like a bad joke. All right, let's go to the animation. Let's see, that's what happens when you squeeze in a bunch of new material at the last minute. I got an inspiration this morning. I woke up, I said, I know what I'm going to do. So Drosophila is the most frequently studied insect in all of science, and here's what they would do in this particular case. You take the single fertilized cell, so it's one cell with one batch of DNA. The mother and the father DNA have come together. It's the single cell, that's like the stem cell. And if you clone that one cell, you'll get two organisms, right? That's what the embryo grows out of. That means that all the DNA is in this one cell. Then they take out all of the DNA code that they've identified through painstaking research is responsible for making the eyes. And it's pretty obvious because once the eyes are gone and the creature grows up, it doesn't have eyes. So sure enough, the fruit fly is then born. It doesn't have any eyes. And then what they do is they do this to other fruit flies as well, and those other fruit flies also are born without eyes, and then they breed them. So they have nobody else to mate with. They can only mate with the flies with no eyes. No matter how this has ever been done in the lab, automatically the eyes are replaced, and it never takes more than 5 generations for this to happen, and that's the most. That's like the longest that it takes. That's if nature isn't really doing a very good job. So this is great because this whole idea that they're trying to make Terminator seeds and genetically modify seeds so that they're never going to be able to reproduce, that's not actually how it works. So this is, it's not actually from the same study, but on the left you have a mutation of the fly where it doesn't have eyes, and then after a very short time, it puts the eyes back in. Well, the problem is, that can't come from DNA. The DNA doesn't have the code anymore. So you have to totally redo science, and this is where we get back to the idea that that little fruit fly has a soul. It has an energetic pattern that makes it into the normal fruit fly that we now see. Another really cool example that I want to give you comes in a very strange way from the Italian wall lizard. And this lizard actually went through a spontaneous evolution over a 36-year period. This is another very rarely reported scientific fact that happened. So what's going on here? In 1971, 5 adult pairs of Podarcus sicula, which is one of the types, that's the basic name for this wall lizard, 5 adults, so male and female, so 10 altogether, were moved from their home island in the South Adriatic Sea. Their home island was a desert called Pod Capisti. And on that desert, it was very dry. They didn't have plants. And their only diet was small insects, which are very easy to chew, so it doesn't require a lot of biting power. Then they were moved by these scientists to a new island called Pod Mercaru, and this new island was all vegetation. It only had vegetation. It didn't have, well, it still had insects, but now these little lizards became vegetarian. They ate plants because now they had a whole different diet. So this was done in 1971, and up until this time, that wall lizard never existed on Pod Mercaru. That island with all the vegetation did not have these lizards. So the scientists returned in the summer of 2004, 2005, and 2006. And what they found was totally amazing. They captured the lizards, they measured them for the length of their snout vent, the size of their head, and their actual body mass, and they also took clips of DNA off of the tails and confirmed that they were genetically identical to their original source population. But here's the crazy part. There were striking differences in the size and the shape of their heads. Their bite pressure had become much stronger, and in the really most baffling thing of all, they developed completely new structures in their digestive system after only 36 years. So this is actually the cecal valve that was grown in, and what this is a little pocket in the stomach that holds fermentation, because you need to ferment vegetables in order to digest them, which you don't have to do with insects. So they literally grew a fermentation factory in their body that their bodies never had before. And their jaws became a lot thicker so that they could, the muscles of the jaw and the size of the mouth became a lot thicker because they had to bite harder to get through these plants. So here you have different types of this lizard, and we're literally seeing the whole body got larger. So it went from something more like A down to something more like C. The head gets larger, the bite pressure gets higher, and it grows a completely new digestive system. So these are adaptive changes that allowed them to be able to eat plants, and interestingly enough, they also stopped the instinctive behavior of defending their territory. So this is a fascinating new study. And it only came out recently, but what is it ultimately telling us? It's telling us that there is a whole new science to look at here, and it's a science in which evolution is not random. Evolution is not caused by mutation. Evolution is intelligently guided, and when those little lizards were stressed by being put on this island that they didn't normally belong on, their genetics adapted. When that little roundworm was stressed by being put in an environment of only lactose, it adapted. When the fruit flies were stressed by losing their eyes, they adapted. There's another story that I didn't have time to put in here, which is Darwin's finches. These birds in the Galapagos Islands that had beaks that were only a certain shape. And then as the climate would change, sometimes they'd have to peck for these little tiny seeds, and their beak would actually elongate so they could get the seeds, and it happened over a very short period of time. So this totally changes the game. Now, with that being said, we have a nice little break point where we're going to go back into the Tibetan side of things, but I have to piss so bad. So I'm going to go behind the building here. Please don't walk around. But everybody, if you need a break, we'll do a little 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. Thank you.